Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. When Jonathan Miller moved to a quiet suburb, he was looking for peace and solitude. But a simple wooden fence caused a violent conflict with the overbearing HOA and its leader, Ellen Reeves. What began as a struggle for rights turned into a legal war that changed the entire community forever. I had always thought moving to the suburbs would bring me the kind of peace city life could never offer. After years of grinding through late nights and early mornings in a cramped apartment surrounded by the constant hum of urban chaos, I was ready for something quieter, something more permanent. That's how I ended up here, a pristine little neighborhood tucked away at the edge of town, bordered by trees and far from the sound of honking horns or blaring sirens. I completely forgot to introduce myself. My name is Jonathan Miller. The house I chose was at the very end of a cul-de-sac, a quaint two-story with a wraparound porch and enough yard space to finally start the garden I'd always dreamed of. What sealed the deal was the backyard, a slice of tranquility that extended to the edge of a forest. It felt private, shielded, like my own personal haven. But as I'd come to learn, privacy here was not entirely under my control. One of the selling points of this community was its HOA. At the time, I saw it as a positive, a promise of clean streets, tidy lawns, and a sense of order. The glossy brochure boasted about security and harmony, a place where everyone worked together to maintain a high standard of living. It all sounded idyllic. That is, until I actually moved in. I started small, unpacking the essentials and gradually settling in. One of my first projects was the fence. The backyard, while beautiful, felt too exposed for my liking. The old chain-link fence left behind by the previous owners wasn't enough to keep out wandering wildlife, let alone provide the privacy I craved. So I did my research, filed the necessary permits, and hired a local contractor to build a sturdy wooden fence. It wasn't ostentatious, just a classic design that complemented the house. Most importantly, it was well within my property line. The fence went up smoothly, and for a while, everything felt perfect. I could sip coffee on the back porch without feeling like I was on display. The days were quiet, the nights even quieter. My work-from-home setup thrived in this new environment, and for the first time in years, I felt I had room to breathe. But the whispers started sooner than I expected. My next-door neighbor, an older man named Paul, struck up a conversation while I was mowing the lawn one afternoon. "Nice place you've got here," he said, gesturing toward the fence. "Just a heads up, though. HOA doesn't usually take too kindly to folks making changes, even if they're by the book." I laughed it off, thanking him for the advice, but dismissing it as paranoia. I'd followed the rules. My paperwork was in order, and there was nothing for them to complain about. Still, Paul's warning lingered in the back of my mind. Then came the other comments. A woman down the street mentioned, almost casually, how strict the HOA president, Ellen Reeves, could be. "She's got an eye for details," she said with a tight smile. Sometimes too much of an eye, if you ask me. Ellen's reputation began to take shape through these passing remarks. Stories of fines for mismatched mailbox colors, notices for hedges trimmed an inch too short. It was clear she ran this community like a personal empire. But I figured as long as I stayed within the lines, I'd be fine. After all, my fence was legal. I had nothing to worry about. At least, that's what I told myself. 2 months after the fence was completed, I found a letter from the HOA stuffed into my mailbox. The envelope was heavy and official-looking, stamped with their crest, like a decree from some feudal lord. I wasn't expecting anything from them, so I opened it with mild curiosity, only to feel my stomach drop as I read the first few lines. The letter stated in no uncertain terms that my fence violated community regulations and needed to be removed immediately. The justification? It allegedly encroached on communal property and interfered with plans for a proposed road expansion. This was the first I'd heard about any road. At the bottom of the letter, in bold type, was a warning. Failure to comply would result in escalating fines and potential legal action. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. I'd been meticulous during the planning process, double-checking property lines and obtaining every necessary permit. My fence was well within my boundaries, and there was no evidence of any pending roadwork in the area. The whole thing felt surreal, like they were targeting me for no reason. I immediately dug up the documents I'd used to secure the permits and scheduled a call with a lawyer just in case. He confirmed what I already knew. My fence was entirely legal. Feeling a mixture of anger and confidence, I drafted a response to the HOA. I attached copies of the permits and a detailed explanation of why their demands were baseless, ending with a polite but firm request for them to rescind the letter. A week later, I received their response. It wasn't an apology or a retraction. Instead, it was another letter, even more aggressive than the first. The fines had doubled, and the language was sharper, accusing me of blatant disregard for community standards and endangering the well-being of the neighborhood. I couldn't believe the audacity. This wasn't just bureaucracy. It felt personal. I was still fuming when my phone rang late one afternoon. The caller ID displayed a number I didn't recognize, but something told me to answer. "Mr. Miller," the voice on the other end said, crisp and authoritative. "This is Ellen Reeves, the president of the HOA." Her tone was as sharp as the letters, devoid of any pleasantries. "I wanted to discuss the matter of your fence," she continued, her words laced with condescension. "It's causing quite a bit of trouble." "I don't see how," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "I've provided all the necessary documentation proving that my fence is within legal bounds." Ellen's response was ice cold. "Documentation or not, your fence is a problem. You can either remove it voluntarily, or we'll take matters into our own hands. And believe me, Mr. Miller, you don't want to see what that looks like." I couldn't tell if it was a bluff or a genuine threat, but her words left no doubt about her intentions. She wasn't interested in compromise or fairness. This was a power play, plain and simple. As the call ended, my confidence wavered for the first time. What was I up against, and how far was Ellen willing to go to make me fall in line? The day started like any other. I left for work early, a bit frustrated but determined to put the HOA nonsense out of my mind. My lawyer had assured me we had a solid case if they pushed further, and I tried to focus on my tasks rather than Ellen Reeves' threats echoing in the back of my head. Little did I know, that morning marked the beginning of something far worse than angry letters or phone calls. When I returned home that evening, the first thing I noticed was the debris scattered across my driveway. My heart sank as I stepped out of the car, taking in the full scope of the destruction. My once pristine wooden fence lay in shattered pieces along the edges of my yard. The posts were ripped out of the ground, some snapped clean in half, while others were tossed carelessly into the surrounding brush. But the fence wasn't the only casualty. The young trees I'd planted just a few months earlier were broken, their fragile trunks splintered as if they'd been stomped on. My flower beds were trampled, the bright petals now a mess of crushed stems and uprooted soil. The irrigation system I'd installed with painstaking care had been ripped apart, its components scattered like trash. My backyard, my sanctuary, looked like a battlefield. I stood there in disbelief, a mix of rage and helplessness boiling inside me. Who could do this? Why would anyone go to such extremes? It didn't take long for me to piece it together. This wasn't random vandalism. It was a deliberate attack, and I knew exactly who was behind it. My first instinct was to confront my neighbors, hoping someone might have seen or heard something. But when I knocked on doors, the responses were evasive. "I'm sorry, I didn't notice anything," one said, avoiding eye contact. Another neighbor simply shrugged and muttered something about not wanting to get involved. Their silence spoke volumes. Fear of the HOA, or more specifically of Ellen Reeves, kept them from speaking up. Frustrated but determined, I turned to the one resource that couldn't be intimidated: my security cameras. I'd installed them when I moved in, mostly as a precaution, never expecting they'd be crucial in proving an act of sabotage. Pulling up the footage from that day, my hands trembled as I fast-forwarded through hours of nothingness, until I saw them. The recording showed a crew of workers arriving in unmarked trucks just after 10 a.m. They wasted no time bringing heavy tools to dismantle the fence with brutal efficiency. As I watched, my anger shifted into cold fury. They weren't just removing the fence, they were destroying it, ripping out posts and tossing them carelessly across the yard. One of them trampled the flower beds, while another yanked at the irrigation lines like they were weeds. And then she appeared, Ellen Reeves herself, standing in the middle of the chaos like a general overseeing her troops. She gestured emphatically, directing the workers with a pointed finger and a stern expression. At one point, a worker hesitated, seemingly questioning whether they had the right to continue. I could just make out her response on the audio. "Don't stop." He had his chance to cooperate. That was it. Proof. irrefutable evidence of her involvement, her blatant disregard for legality or decency. As the footage ended, I felt the weight of what I'd seen settle over me. This wasn't just about offense anymore. It was about standing up to someone who thought she was untouchable, and I wasn't going to let her get away with it. The next morning, I was sitting in a lawyer's office, my phone still buzzing with notifications from the footage I'd uploaded to the cloud. The decision to take legal action wasn't difficult. What they had done wasn't just illegal, it was personal. My lawyer, a no-nonsense man named David Gray, reviewed the video evidence with a look of grim satisfaction. "This is a gold mine," he said, tapping a pen against the table. "It's not just trespassing, it's destruction of property. And with her there directing the crew, it's going to be hard for Ellen Reeves to wiggle out of this." David wasted no time filing a formal lawsuit against the HOA and Ellen personally. The charges included unlawful destruction of property, trespassing, and emotional distress. He assured me we had a solid case, but I couldn't help feeling the weight of what lay ahead. Taking on Ellen Reeves wasn't just about my fence anymore. It was about holding her accountable for years of unchecked power. As we prepared for court, David began digging into HOA's financial records. What he found was staggering. Ellen had been using community funds like her personal bank account. Payments for luxury hotels, first-class flights, and high-end dining littered the records, all under vague descriptions like community relations or administrative costs. One particularly egregious expense was a spa weekend labeled as a board meeting. Armed with this information, we knew the case wasn't just about my fence anymore. It was about exposing a pattern of abuse that extended far beyond my property. But we needed more than just legal filings. We needed public support. That's when I decided to go public. I posted the security footage online, adding a concise explanation of what had happened and why I was pursuing legal action. Within hours, the video started gaining traction. Comments flooded in, with people expressing shock and outrage at Ellen's blatant abuse of power. Some claimed they had experienced similar harassment from their own HOAs, while others demanded justice for the destruction of my property. The story quickly caught the attention of local media. Reporters reached out for interviews, and within days, my small neighborhood drama had turned into a citywide scandal. The HOA's reputation was in freefall, and Ellen was the face of their downfall. Residents who had previously stayed silent began to speak up, sharing stories of fines for minor infractions and threats that felt more like extortion than community management. Ellen, predictably, didn't take this lying down. Her lawyers issued a public statement accusing me of slander and malicious attempts to destabilize the community. They claimed the workers had acted without Ellen's direct authorization and that I had twisted the situation for personal gain. But the video didn't lie, and neither did the financial records David had unearthed. Public opinion was firmly on my side, and even some members of the HOA board began distancing themselves from Ellen. Every step Ellen took to discredit me only made her look more desperate. The more she flailed, the clearer it became that this was about more than just offense. It was about power, corruption, and her belief that she was untouchable. And now, for the first time, she was facing someone who wouldn't back down. The day of the trial arrived, and I sat in the courtroom, my nerves sharp but steady. David had assured me we were prepared, but stepping into that room felt like walking onto a battlefield. On one side sat Ellen Reeves, flanked by her expensive legal team, exuding her usual air of superiority. On the other side, it was me, David, and a growing stack of evidence that threatened to dismantle her reign over the HOA. The case began with the video. The footage played on a large screen before the court was impossible to refute. It showed Ellen standing in my backyard giving orders to the workers as they tore apart my fence. The audio captured her cold, calculated commands and the moment she dismissed a worker's concern about proper permits. The courtroom was silent as the clip ended, the evidence hanging in the air like a heavy weight. Next came the financial records. David laid out a meticulous trail of Ellen's spending, highlighting everything from lavish vacations to spa retreats, all paid for with HOA funds. As he spoke, I watched Ellen's composed facade begin to crack. Her lawyers objected, claiming the expenses were legitimate, but the numbers didn't lie. The records painted a damning picture of greed and entitlement. Then came the neighbors. A few brave residents had stepped forward despite their initial fears of retaliation. One by one, they took the stand, recounting stories of Ellen's intimidation tactics, fines for imaginary infractions, threats of legal action, and even attempts to block home sales unless her demands were met. All of it came spilling out. Each testimony added another layer to the narrative of her abuse of power. The turning point came when David revealed a series of forged documents Ellen had submitted to justify her actions against my fence. Permits she claimed supported the road expansion were proven to be fraudulent, created solely to bolster her case. The revelation sent a ripple through the courtroom. It was no longer just about the fence. It was about systemic corruption. Public outrage, which had already been simmering, boiled over as news outlets picked up the details of the trial. Residents who had once stayed silent began organizing meetings, demanding transparency from the HOA and calling for Ellen's immediate resignation. Social media was flooded with posts condemning her actions, and the once pristine reputation of the community was in shambles. Throughout the trial, Ellen's lawyers fought to deflect blame, arguing that she had acted in the community's best interest. But their arguments rang hollow against the mountain of evidence. Each piece chipped away at her credibility until there was nothing left but the undeniable truth. Ellen had exploited her position for personal gain, and her downfall was inevitable. By the time the trial concluded, it wasn't just about my case anymore. It had become a reckoning for an entire community that had suffered under Ellen's rule. I walked out of the courtroom that day, knowing we were closer to justice, not just for me, but for everyone who had endured her abuse. And for the first time in months, I felt the weight on my shoulders begin to lift. The courtroom was packed on the final day, the air heavy with anticipation. Everyone in attendance seemed to know this was more than just a verdict. It was a reckoning. Ellen Reeves sat stiffly across the aisle, her once unshakable confidence now reduced to a mask barely holding itself together. Her legal team whispered furiously, likely preparing for damage control. As for me, I was exhausted but resolute. After months of fighting, the end was finally in sight. The judge cleared his throat, commanding the room's attention. After reviewing the evidence and testimonies, he began, his voice steady and deliberate. This court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Jonathan Miller. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The weight of those words sank in as a wave of relief washed over me. The judge continued, outlining the details of the ruling. The HOA was ordered to pay $150,000 in damages, compensation for the destroyed fence, the ruined garden, and the mental and emotional distress their actions had caused. The amount wasn't just a financial victory. It was a public acknowledgement of the harm they had inflicted. The next part hit harder. Regarding the actions of Ellen Reeves, the judge said, glancing at her with a stern expression, this court finds sufficient evidence of financial misconduct, fraud, and unlawful intrusion. Ms. Reeves is hereby sentenced to 18 months in state prison. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Ellen's face turned ashen, and for the first time, the cracks in her composure gave way to panic. Her lawyers immediately rose, requesting leniency, but the judge shut them down. This community has suffered under your leadership, he said, addressing Ellen directly. Your actions were not only illegal, but a betrayal of the trust placed in you by your neighbors. As she was escorted from the courtroom, the reality of her downfall finally hit her. She protested, claiming she had only acted in the community's best interest, but her words fell on deaf ears. The residents who had gathered to watch the trial broke into quiet murmurs, some shaking their heads, others outright applauding the decision. The judge wasn't done. He turned his attention back to the HOA. The board of the HOA is hereby ordered to conduct a full audit of its practices and implement governance reforms to ensure such abuses of power do not occur again. Additionally, an interim leadership team will be appointed to oversee these changes. It was a sweeping decision, one that sent a clear message. The era of unchecked authority was over. As the proceedings came to a close, I felt a sense of vindication that was almost overwhelming. This wasn't just about me. It was a victory for everyone who had been silenced, bullied, or taken advantage of by those who thought they were untouchable. Walking out of the courtroom, I was met with a mix of handshakes, pats on the back, and words of gratitude from neighbors who had once been too afraid to stand up. The transformation was striking. The community had found its voice, and it was clear that Ellen's reign of terror had galvanized them into action. For the first time since moving to this neighborhood, I felt at peace. Justice had been served, not just in the form of monetary compensation or Ellen's prison sentence, but in the knowledge that we had reclaimed our community. As I looked around at the faces of those who had supported me, I knew this was more than an ending. It was a new beginning. The first thing I did after the settlement funds were deposited was call the contractor who had built my original fence. It felt symbolic, a way of reclaiming what had been taken. But this time, I didn't just want the fence restored. I wanted it fortified, a clear boundary that said, "This is my space, and it's not to be crossed." Watching the workers carefully install each plank felt oddly therapeutic. My backyard, once a battlefield, was slowly transforming back into the sanctuary I had envisioned when I first moved in. The new fence was sturdier, with reinforced posts and a natural finish that blended seamlessly with the surrounding greenery. As they worked, I replanted the flower beds and replaced the young trees that had been destroyed, adding new ones to create a more lush and vibrant landscape. By the time it was finished, my yard felt like more than just a space. It felt like a victory. But the changes didn't stop at my property line. The community was shifting too. The trial had shaken people out of complacency, and the HOA's power had been dismantled piece by piece. Ellen's absence was palpable, but not missed. Her iron grip on the neighborhood had been replaced by a new sense of openness and accountability. Residents who had once stayed silent were now stepping forward, organizing meetings and pushing for reforms. I found myself unexpectedly at the center of this transformation. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now stopped to chat, sharing their own stories and ideas for how we could make the community better. One day, during a casual conversation, someone suggested I run for the HOA board. I laughed it off at first, but the idea stuck with me. After everything I'd been through, I realized I didn't just want to protect my own rights. I wanted to ensure no one else would have to face what I had. Reluctantly, I agreed to step into the role. To my surprise, the support was overwhelming. At the first meeting with the interim board, I spoke about the importance of transparency and fairness, principles I had fought so hard to defend. It wasn't just about fences or fines anymore. It was about building a community where everyone felt respected and valued. Looking back, it's strange to think how a simple fence had set all of this in motion. When I moved here, I had hoped for a quiet life, free from conflict. Instead, I found myself in a battle I never wanted but couldn't walk away from. And yet, I wouldn't change a thing. The experience taught me that sometimes peace isn't something you find. It's something you fight for. Now, as I sit on my back porch, the new fence standing tall, and the garden in full bloom, I feel a profound sense of calm. The neighborhood isn't perfect, but it's better, more united, more thoughtful, more willing to stand up for what's right. And as the sun sets over the trees, I realize that in reclaiming my space, I've also found my place in this community. Did you enjoy the story? Want more thrilling plots with unexpected twists? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications.